third year students upstairs in a review who must be here, but I'll start and pad it until they arrive. Welcome to the School of Architecture lecture series. I will make a couple of announcements. First of all, please come tomorrow at noon to our last Garofalo Fellow candidate, which will be here at noon. Pier Paolo Tamburelli from Italy is coming, so please come to that talk at noon. Wednesday episode is the career fair, and then at 5 o'clock on Wednesday is the exhibition reception for the social circle competition. Yeah. Thanks for coming. It's a pleasure to welcome Emmanuel Petit to UIC for the first time. I should clarify to any soccer fans in the audience that this is not the French midfielder from Arsenal, Emmanuel Petit, but the architect, historian, theorist, Emmanuel Petit. So I don't want him to be here under false pretenses. But it's a little bit unnerving when you do Google Emmanuel Petit, because the first headlines you get are, Emmanuel Petit tells of swinging and cocaine use. Not him. The other one. Not that he's not a fun guy, just saying. He went to the ETH. Maybe the more surprising fact about Emmanuel's work is that this is his first time visit to UIC, because in some way his work, I think, in architecture serves as a kind of intellectual history for this particular institution and school. Emmanuel received his architecture diploma from the ETH in Zurich and his MA and PhD from Princeton, from where I like to think he's a black sheep, but that may be my own wish fulfillment. And he's currently an associate professor at the Yale School of Architecture. His book, Irony, or The Self-Critical Opacity of Postmodern Architecture, appeared last spring from Yale Press, confirming his standing, I think, as one of the central figures in resituating the recent past of contemporary architecture. Emmanuel is also the editor of Philip Johnston, Constancy of Change, and also the wonderfully titled Schlepping Through Architecture, a collection of writings by Stanley Tigerman. In addition to his own book, his edited books, and his writings, which appeared widely in magazines and journals, Emmanuel is also a regular curator of exhibitions, including 2 at Yale, Ceci n'est pas une rêverie, the architecture of Stanley Tigerman, which also toured and visited the Grant Foundation, and in Architect's Legacy, James Sterling Students at Yale, 1959 to 1983. And he was also the co-curator of Peter Eisenman's exhibition, Barefoot on White Hot Walls, at the University of Applied Arts Museum in Vienna. Emmanuel's most recent book, Irony, looks at a period that is much on our historical and contemporary radar as well. Architecture, you could say, between the destructions of the 2 Yamasaki projects, the implosion of Pruitt-Igoe in 1972, and the destruction of the World Trade Towers in 2001. In other words, the period between the passing of a modernist faith in simple problem solving and the most recent return to an engagement with external urgencies, whether terrorism and security, the environment, the economy, and so on. You could say he's looking at this 30-year reprieve period between those 2 moments of architecture's earnestness, when it was focused on its own internal critique and development, and that it's that and those traits that Emmanuel sees as central to the story of postmodern architecture. What he calls self-critical opacity is in distinction to what you could say is self-evident transparency of much of what passed for architectural modernism. In other words, against architecture's transparency of inside to outside, the plan is the generator, of form to function, form follows function, material to expression, what a brick wants to be, or for that matter, architecture to building, or even ideas to things. Against that, Emmanuel invokes a period when relationships among those pairs were complicated and suspended, and he focuses in that book on the work of Terry Scott Brown, Stanley Tigerman, Arata Isazaki, Peter Eisenman, and Ron Koolhaas, all under the umbrella of philosophical irony. Of course, Yale, where Emmanuel has been teaching for almost 12 years, is one ground zero for that particular construction of history, but so too is UIC. beginning its 3-year MArch program in the late 70s, in the immediate aftermath of the founding of Architecture Chicago 7, two of whose founding members, Tom Beebe and Stanley Tigerman, would serve as directors of the school from 1980 to 93, with Beebe going on to become the dean at Yale. And the earlier presence here of Alvin Boyarsky, who, as chair of the AA, would become a significant Chicago influence on Rem Koolhaas. Important for our history, this has also been a source for a fair amount of the scholarship and, I would say, generative design work that has come out of the school in recent years, constituting a reenactment, to use Sam Jacobs' term, of the 40-year history of this school and the city. As with Emmanuel, for us, this return highlights architecture's engagement with the discursive or the polemical aspects, roles of architecture. For this, I think we can count Emmanuel as a distant cousin or fellow traveler, for whom the architectural discipline and forms of expertise are central, with an attentiveness to swerving from past precedent to make room for possibilities that in the current humor-challenged age in which we live seem unthinkable. And this narrative, Emmanuel, is, again, I like to think, the black sheep of the Princeton program, for whom many of those figures, those central figures in that history can only be revisited with a certain disdain or derisiveness. But if UIC and Yale are unified in some ways, it might also be true that one difference between us and Yale is they don't really seem to get the joke there. In any case, please join me in welcoming our East Coast representative from UIC Architecture's Emmanuel Petit.
Thanks very much, Bob, for inviting me. I must say that having this name helps me get the good tables at restaurants, especially in France. So sometimes it helps, but I guess in academia it's not really helpful to be taken for a soccer player. This was the first invitation that I ever got where I wasn't asked like 4 months ahead of time what the title of my talk is. I find it very refreshing because I would have not known what to tell you. But I found the title. I'm not sure if it has anything to do with the talk, but here it is. I love to come to Chicago. I have very fond memories of the time I spent here with Stanley Tigerman a few years ago in the warehouse at different locations. It was freezing cold, opening boxes, digging into his archive, because we were bringing all this stuff to Yale. I curated and mounted an exhibition of his work at Yale. I thought as an introduction, since this is Chicago after all, I would just show you what that looked like when it was at Yale. After we took it down in Yale, it came to the Graham Foundation in Chicago, where some of you might have seen it. And I was particularly attentive to the surrealist, existentialist, and maybe absurdist streak in Stanley's work. You can see the clouds flying around. The exhibition title was modeled on Magritte, of course, Ceci n'est pas une rêverie, suggesting that architecture is always a kind of dream, a pipe dream. And if you think it is more pragmatic than that, I want to remind you that it is, before anything else, a pipe dream. On the same occasion, I edited a book of Bob's collected essays, Schlepping Through Ambivalence, essays on an American architectural condition. Peter Eisenman called me up and said, if you as editor allow this title to go through, I will hate you forever because you will participate in destroying one of my good friends. Well, the title is on the book. I don't think it destroyed Stanley. In fact, I really think that it stands for a lot of ideas of Stanley. But I will not talk about anything connected to Stanley Tigerman today, or postmodernism. I just wanted to bring it up to represent, in fact, my interest in the spatiality of postmodernism in architecture. In other words, why postmodernism has mostly been talked about in the context of Marxist criticism. Think of Tafuri, Jameson, now Reinhold Martin, a whole list of people, on the one hand, and semiotic theory on the other. Think Charles Jenks and company, I felt that as architects we owe ourselves an analysis of what constituted postmodern space and what the characteristics of that space were. So I followed how division and non-identity were the generators of space in the postmodern, and it was the mechanism illustrated in drawings like this one by Saul Steinberg, the cartoonist for the New Yorker magazine, who was in fact trained as an architect, that could, in my mind, epitomize how all spaces and forms in postmodernism were understood as doubles. It is the discrepancy, or the idea of non-identity, between the physical cube, and in this sense, in this case, the metaphysical cube, the metaphysical condition of the cube that the cube dreams of, that could generate postmodern space. And once I dug into the topic, I understood that the idea of non-identity, of the figure of two cubes, or in this case, two doors, are really the foundation of any philosophy, any thinking of paradox, and eventually of irony. And you can see that from Zeno of Elea, this philosopher, pre-Socratic philosopher, leading the youth in Athens to the double door of truth and falsity. And it is that moment where you confront this double door where, in fact, the tension is maximal, where you don't know which door to go into. I think Magritte, of course, picked that up. Ungers took that idea from Magritte, meaning you see an architectural column, but in fact what you see is not really an architectural column, but it is the shadow of an architectural column. This is when the column, the kind of substance of classical architecture, becomes really inhabitable, because it turns into a space itself. I kept digging. I found Kierkegaard, the philosopher of irony, who would even write double books like this one, either or. He couldn't fit the argument into just one book. It had to be two books because the issue is so damn complex. And in fact, every time you think about what to do next, you have to face a decision that is always a decision between one thing or another thing. That's the moment of maximum tension that I felt was the very foundation of all of postmodern architecture. And I can show you a whole bunch of examples, but I just picked out a few for you. Oswald Matthias Ungers, a double house in Berlin-Spandau, which was his own second house, and the house is here a mirror image, mirrored across a plane that is in fact a historical city wall. Or, you know well, Peter Eisenman. Here in the case of house 6, you have two stairs, one of which is merely the kind of representation or shadow of a stair, is not a functional stair, but all of Eisenman's work, if you really want to understand it, starts when the single cube doubles up, and when suddenly you are faced with a spacing, a kind of paradox between the first cube and the double cube that is identical in kind. It's kind of the architectural stem cell, but also has that space that makes it unidentical with the first one. And then Stanley Tigerman did his Little House in the Clouds in 1976. This was in the first exhibition where the Chicago 7 were founded. So why is this a double house? Well, I think for exactly the same reason, for this paradox that is endemic to all postmodern space. John Haydock, another one that I think is also was important for Bob. Here, the crossover house. It is the house for an existentialist who doesn't know which half of the house to live in. So he has two half houses with a bridge leading over a ditch, and he has to always make a decision between what half of the house to live in. Very existentialist, but this is the paradox that created postmodern space. And then Eduardo Chirigawa, who is one of my favorite artists, he too was educated as an architect, funnily enough. And I just picked out this sculpture because it is the poet's house, and it is from 1980, so exactly the kind of period that I wanted to theorize in that context. So the poet's house is a double house because the poet always confronts a language, a world that is in fact paradoxical, that is never clear and never pragmatic. And OMA, in a slightly different version, what did the floating swimming pool that was published in Delirious New York stand for? Well, there are of course the communist officers that swim towards the Kremlin, and because action equals reaction, the boats, the floating swimming pool, in fact, drifts to New York, to the place of capitalism. So there too we have a kind of double structure at work, like in the other projects. So you can see that for me, postmodernism was not about stylistic differences, because I think they have been pointed out often enough. I felt that instead of saying that postmodernism was simply about pluralism, I felt there was a common idea that we can identify in different architects, in different styles, a common idea for what the space of postmodern architecture stands for. So after my book on the postmodern is out, I have moved forward in time and am now interested in the ideas and morphologies of architectural space today. Now, my talk today is going to build on and develop ideas that I published in the context of Log's MoMA conference and in Log 29 issue last September, entitled In Pursuit of Architecture, where Cynthia Davidson had asked 4 critics, Sam Jacob, who you know well, Sarah Whiting, Sylvia Levin, and myself, to reflect on where architecture is today and what its current themes are. I suggested something very zeitgeisty. I claimed that in the past decade or so, we have in fact seen a new type of spatiality emerge, a space-time-form-atmosphere complex in a whole series of buildings and art installations, and I'm referring to spatial formations like this one, Coop Himmelblau's BMW World, Anish Kapoor's ArcelorMittal Orbit Tower in London, Foster & Partners London City Hall, Thomas Saraceno's In Orbit, UN Studios Mercedes-Benz Museum, and the list could be extended indefinitely, which would confirm my point. And if I just walked around studios here and I saw a lot of round things, I think that would also confirm my theory. These space objects have something in common. They appear to be involuted, they turn inwards, and they are gravitational. They are drawn centripetally towards certain attractors, instead of thematizing their participation in an expansive open space or urban texture of which they would want to be a fragment or a puzzle piece. In the context of the Log publication, I argued that these buildings are symptoms of a complete restructuring of the urban territory according to the contemporary structural logic of a global media environment. These buildings are not really related to their physical context as much as they are to be seen as terminals for education, shopping, living, politics, and exhibition, and that the way we think of space today in terms of distant hubs or terminals that connect strategic points across the globe, and the round globe I might remind you of, let's not forget that the imagery that is being used to suggest information flows and communication links across the globe, just check the Google images that you find if you just Google for cloud connectivity or global connectivity. These are the types of images that you get. The times where all this was visualized in terms of an extensive grid is over, meaning metaphors, visual metaphors, change, and that for the reason that our understanding of space is changing, is transforming. Sometimes the buildings I showed you are the only reason to visit a city in the first place. It is all about those buildings. These are the terminals, the destinations we go to. I brought up the new broadcast studio of the German national TV channel ZDF, a space that has been nicknamed Green Hell, Grüne Hölle, because its boundaries are all greenwashed for chroma keying. So this is like, architecture has turned green, here it is. Meaning this is a space that is completely introverted and gravitates around only a central island or an anchor, the newscast desk. While the space is totally enclosed and cavernous, it becomes the ultimate window on the world when all sorts of visual material is mounted digitally on its walls. And you can even represent virtual objects next to real people as if they were actually standing next to one another. This is the moment when the experience of the space becomes totally immersive. The media act as the software for architecture. They create what one can call a world, a total environment, as an alternative to the traditional environment that we are used to. You can also take the example of the spaces of global media events, like here from the opening of the Sochi Winter Olympics from a few weeks ago. This stadium is an internalized terminal where the rhetoric of architectural form is completely flexible and temporary. You see real people here, you might not see it, but you have to believe that there are real people here walking or dancing on top of an image that is in fact projected onto the grass in the stadium, which was the big innovation of these Olympics, at least the opening of the Olympics. We didn't see that in London, we didn't see it in Beijing before, that 60 projectors could just give the illusion of one big screen, the ground being one big screen. So what you get is that the physical and media realities merge into a world unto itself. It's in the form of a Gesamtkunstwerk. You realize that the postmodern reflex would have been to heighten the discrepancy between the different realities and draw attention to the difference between physical reality and the media reality, to draw attention to these incongruities. But here things have changed dramatically. These differences get merged, synthesized, or fused into a third condition. While Louis Kahn could still say that good buildings make good ruins, these buildings are unable to produce ruins. The equivalent now is that they go blank as soon as the electricity goes off, because precisely they have no inherent formal being, nor do they have any relation to their physical context that they appear in. Now, my interest in these involuted spaces is not from the perspective of a cultural theorist or a sociologist, but as an architect. Therefore, I'm not simply going to argue that architecture has been killed by the media studio in the logic of ceci tuera cela, this will kill that, right? Now it's not the printing press that destroys the symbolic dimension of architecture, but now it's the media. I'm not going to argue that. But I want to understand what the basis of architectural form, architectural morphology, is in this new context, and where all this eventually fits in the discussion of architectural theory. And because I want this to be about form, I will eventually talk about what we can do now, what we can now do with Colin Rowe's theories. Just because Colin Rowe is a formalist who, in my training, played a very big role. Because for Rowe, this new spatiality would have been unthinkable in the very literal or the most literal sense of the word. Meaning, we would not think that these are graspable forms that help us conceptualize these spaces. And therefore, the examples I want to discuss are not the architecturally quite numb Green Hell or the Sochi Stadium, but involuted spaces that were generated by architects. Given my prior work on the postmodern and on the way architectural form and cultural or philosophical meaning are brought together in the notion of articulate form, I felt that we are today in a really completely different place compared to 3 or 4 decades ago. The discussion has changed, and so have architectural forms and spaces. Now, today when architects talk about form, the discussion turns away from metaphysics and towards immanence, by which I mean to say 4 things. That with the help of digital design technology, architects have started to believe in the generative self-sufficiency of cultural codes. Form is not seen as the transcription of allegorical ideas. Form doesn't stand for ideas anymore in the same way. So the argument is that matter has the capacity for self-organization, and that therefore a building tends to be based on a coherent internal morphology that isolates itself from everything that does not come out of the same code, meaning the whole context in which the building sits. As an example, I think one can give one can offer the Toyo Ito Taichung Metropolitan Opera House. Even though you don't see any form swirl around the center like the buildings that I showed you in the beginning, this building has an extreme level of internal coherence that makes it read as an interior which is isolated against the space of the city. A second aspect of immanence is the turn to centrally immersive environments, like Anish Kapoor's Leviathan installation at the Parisian Grand Palais. In contradistinction to the cerebral forms of postmodern architecture, everything here turns central, immersive, and directed to the embodied psycho-intellectual subject, no longer the thinking subject. In fact, the Leviathan transmogrifies a highly articulate Art Deco building of the Grand Palais into a mere primitive volumetric lump that has nevertheless quite a sublime affective impact. So Capot's space is the outcome of a dramatic loss of geometric resolution of articulate forms of the Grand Palais, and can arguably be understood in the context of the more general affective turn of the intellectual debates throughout the 1990s. I'm mostly referring to the impact of vitalist thinkers, including Georges Bataille, Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, and others. Another example of that kind of aspect of immanence is the series of luminaria by architects of air, whose inflatables completely eschew the notion of indexical form and foreground only the idea of bodily immersion in volumes of light and color. They are very Bachelardian in the sense that, remember in Bachelard's text, The Phenomenology of Roundness, Bachelard says, it is evident that when a geometrician speaks of volumes, he's only dealing with the surfaces that delimit them. The geometrician's sphere is an empty one, essentially empty. Therefore, it cannot be a good symbol for our phenomenological study of roundness. And then Bachelard proposes how do we read roundness, the form of the round form. He says the difficulty that had to be overcome in his study was to avoid all geometrical evidence. Now that's a challenge for architects, of course. In other words, I had to start with a sort of intimacy of roundness. So suddenly it is about intimacy, that type of sublime feeling rather than geometry of roundness. 3, the third level of immanence is at the level of the urban field. The focus on immanence has created an urbanism that has left behind the open-ended, expansive city. More and more, we see urban proposals which make thematic the side-by-sidedness, the adjacency of enclosed enclaves that do not search for the political dialogue with the other and with the context, but that want to remain autonomous islands, as is visible not least in the satellite image of the Dubai waterfront. And then fourth and last, the turn to immanence in architecture concerns the reinvented role of architectural form. And I'm particularly interested in this one, and that is where the initial examples that I showed you came from. These are those compact buildings that suggest a spatial gravitational loop around internal voids, and which create a visceral sense of centrality and synthesis. This one, by the way, is Massimiliano Fuchs's Maizal Mall in Frankfurt. I thought it was a very powerful space. I had no idea that that space existed in Frankfurt. I walked in and I felt like I was totally in a different world. And I thought that was extremely powerful, and it's not something that we knew from architecture before. Here's another one of the images from the same building. Now, the emergence of involutionary and gravitational spatial form is the symptom of a fundamental departure from the dominant 20th century logic of expansive space, in which you can include both the hegemonic spatial tropes of modernism, by which I mean the grid at the urban level as much as the building level, as much as the dominant metaphor of postmodern space at the urban level that would have been the labyrinth or the text, and maybe the ruin at the level of the building. So you are in Chicago, I don't need to tell you where the grid is, because I think Chicago is kind of all about the grid. The modern grid and the postmodern labyrinth, these 20th century spaces, are spaces of infinite expansion. Ideally, they have no containment, no interior, and therefore they became the armatures of notion of open architecture, the open city, an open text that could at the same time represent and enable societal values like, you name it, democracy, tolerance, equality, inclusion, progress, heterogeneity, evolution, freedom, liberalism, and so on. The grid is a pretty elastic concept or spatial device, since it could stand for ideas through the whole spectrum of 20th century ideologies, from the most left to the most right-wing ones, I would say. Now, to just illustrate this notion of expansive space in early to mid-century modernism, we can look at Moseley Ginsburg's 1924 book, Style and Epoch. This is, one of the main theorists of the constructivist architects. The jacket design is composed in analogy to, and 1 year after, Le Corbusier's Faire une Architecture. But you can see that Le Corbusier shows the deck of a luxurious ocean liner. It's all about straight lines, open space, expansive space, whereas Ginsberg replaces the image with that of another type of boat, the submarine, and the military submarine, in fact. So both the metaphor and the composition are much more dynamic in Ginsberg's case. The submarine is much more compact and enclosed object than the ocean liner, but it is still inserted into a space that is thought of as open and expansive, and that can be dominated. Now, in that book is Ginsberg's analytical series of diagrams that show the progressive transformation of architectural space, form, throughout history. Architecture is transcribed into a sequence of how to deal with vectors and forces in space. So from Greek architecture to modern architecture, and you see R, by the way, is the resulting vector. So he says Greek architecture has no resulting vector because it is perfectly at rest. The horizontal forces and the vertical forces, they compensate each other. Egyptian and Italian architecture has a resulting horizontal vector. Gothic has a vertical vector, of course. The Baroque has an oblique vector, but always symmetrical and pointing into the form of the building. And then the machine comes along. The machine is a paradigm. The submarine, the car. And what changes for modern architecture is that the form doesn't contain the vector anymore, but the vector always shows points outwards of the form asymmetrically. So it's a much more dynamic paradigm. One of the architectural examples is illustrated with a building by the same guy who did the design of the book, the jacket design of the book, Alexander Vesnin, with his brother, and their project for the Palace of Labor. And you see that it is an eminently asymmetrical building where the forces drive outside of the form of the building, meaning there are the vectors, these tension cables, they kind of question the containment of architectural form. And but here too, all the forces point outwards into space that needs to be structured, the space around that needs to be structured. Let me just bring up Siegfried Gideon because he says basically exactly the same thing. Another zeitgeist person, of course. He should not go unmentioned in the context of the modern idea of universal expansive space. In space, time, and architecture, Gideon says something that resonates immediately with Ginsberg's space-time concept. He says, forms are not restricted to their corporeal limits. Forms emanate and model space. Today, we have again become sensitive to the space emanating powers of volumes. This is all part of an optical revolution, by which he, of course, means cubism. The optical revolution at the beginning of this century, which abolished the single viewpoint of perspective. The space emanating qualities of buildings could again be recognized, freed from the restrictive bounds of wall barriers. So the idea here is again that a building is only this tiny little thing, but whatever the building does with its forms emanates and structures the space, the open space that surrounds the building. It's a problem of emanation. What interests me most in these zeitgeist theories, which connect architectural form to the surrounding space, is that spaces have no resistances built in. There's the building and then everything that's around. But there's no resistance in that space. The only aspect which matters is that the boundary of form is porous enough so that no interior is being closed off. Because the interior, of course, used to be, in the 19th century, the space of the bourgeois, for bourgeois passivity and complacency. And that's, of course, bad, bad, bad for Gideon's modernism. So this is the reason Gideon was so interested in the Eiffel Tower, because it doesn't enclose space, but it has this porous structure of trusses that is open to the city and can give structure to the whole space of the city because it's visible from everywhere. But now, involuted spaces, the ones that I want to posit we are back to, are a sort of reversal of this logic of expansive 20th century space. They curl up onto themselves and form interiors rather than extending outwards. However, the current involution of architecture is certainly not simply a return to the centralized symbolic spaces that the conservative art historian Hans Segelmaier was nostalgic about when he argued in Art in Crisis, The Lost Center, that architecture had abolished itself when its aesthetic disconnected from a transcendental metaphysics, meaning when you could have like here with Ledoux, a building that suggested a centrality, but it didn't stand for any symbolism that was shared by society, like, of course, the symbolism of a religious kind. And therefore, for him, the centralized church buildings of the Baroque were the paradigm. But modern architecture just played with centrality without bringing back the metaphysics of centrality. None of the involuted spaces I showed you, indeed, aim at reconstituting the stability of a common metaphysics, a common metasphere, or the heart of an idealized society. In Sedelmayer's view, a building like this would certainly reconfirm the notion that architecture romanticizes the abstract and autonomous world of modernity, and particularly of the machine, and thus produces nothing else than what the Russian constructivists had already done here with this sphere, this autonomous sphere of Leonidov's Lenin Institute, or his series of sketches for the City of the Sun in the 1950s, where spherical architecture detaches itself from the ground and hovers over the world like an artificial sun. So architecture was sent into orbit. But for what societal goal? For what was the metaphysics behind it? So how does one analyze the involuted spaces in order to bind them into a disciplinary discourse? Because they are a reality of contemporary architecture, but we don't really know how to talk about them. One of the relevant precedents for this concave architecture with inward worlds and loops is the work of a modernist who was always more of an outsider and who liked to hang out with the surrealists, such as Yves Tanguy, the guy who painted things like this. This might have triggered his eerie sense that biological and non-organic matter can interact in all kinds of strange ways in a sort of surrealist bio-architectural architecture. And that's Frederick Kiesler is the person I'm talking about. Kiesler's theory of co-realism, that was what he called his theory, saw man and his natural and technological environments in dynamic interdependence and interaction. Here you see his diagram. And you see the characteristic of the architecture that, in fact, I want to make thematic in his diagram, that man and nature and the built environment, they are somehow rotating around the same concerns. And he would define a theory of co-realism where he says that biology, chemistry, electrical sciences, and everything else should somehow work together and build a new type of environment. So Kiesler says this exchange of interacting forces I would call co-reality, and the science of the laws of interrelationships, co-realism. The term co-realism expresses the dynamics of continual interaction between man and his natural and technological environments. And then he illustrates the text with these primitive cells that go into the interactive environment. And you probably, if you know one thing by Kiesler, it is his endless house, which was kind of a house that would always fold on itself. It's like a womb. But it is a house that was built with the idea that you can find an infinite space inside the house, an infinite space on the interior of the house, because you wouldn't have closed corners, but the house would somehow always make walls disappear behind other walls, so you would never, it would never end space. So the idea was to build a kind of house that would be endless at its interior. For him, a building was to be conceptualized as a living organism at very low rates of speed, eliciting polydimensional movements in an endless interior, and man was supposed to be the nucleus of forces. The notion of biotechnique is a notion that he uses in this context. And it is intriguing because it deconstructs the binary opposition between subjects and objects. Together, they are then set in synthetic and inventive relationships. More than a space in the modern sense of the word, the inside of the endless house is a dense medium that creates many correlations at the same time. So, and this is one of his diagrams that shows how all these forces that he sees, this quasi-animation of matter, should work together. And you see that the diagram is quasi the diagram of UN Studios Mercedes-Benz Museum, which I find super intriguing. So biotechnique is what Kiesler wanted architecture to be. Now, recently, German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk invoked a very similar notion, biotechnology, as a domain of truly modern human creativity. Like its medieval antecedent, alchemy, Sloterdijk argues, biotechnology searches to cross-fertilize and synthesize substances that are not conventionally seen in relation to one another. And because they have never been seen in correlation to one another, they remain at first illegible. As part of this epistemological project modeled on biotechnology, this German philosopher quite eloquently re-evaluates the universalist space conception of the West that we've seen so far, the macho architect, the architect who can just say what space out there is supposed to turn into. Well, he proposes a different model. He says he finds a diagram from Martin Heidegger, but it's not important, to suggest that man does not inhabit this big open space, this megasphere any longer, but that man now constructs and he inhabits many more local and small spheres. Man builds spheres. Man doesn't inhabit just a universal space. And just, by the way, completely as an aside, it seems to me that we have seen a very similar idea recently in film, and film is always a very fast way of explaining difficult ideas. I have to bring this film up because of the stunning imagery of the whole city of Paris bending back onto itself. This is, of course, Inception by Christopher Nolan from 2010. Biotechnique makes it possible for Leonardo DiCaprio, the main protagonist here, and his business partner to infiltrate the subconscious of their targets and extract information while experiencing shared dreaming. And so the thematic is exactly the same. When the subject is no longer autonomous and clearly separate from other subjects in space, then the whole geometry of the environment bends back on itself to create an alternative world with its own rules. But back to Sloterdijk. He puts to question the idea of the autonomous subject in space by offering a critique of the psychoanalytical paradigm. Now, what is that? That can stand for the way we understand who we are in space in the 20th century. At the most simple level, in psychoanalysis, and he thematizes Lacan, but that's not so important, subjects acquire their identity in relation to objects or to other entities, meaning I am me, and I know who I am because I'm not you. And so it is in relation to you that I establish my identity. Now that other can be an object or a subject, meaning I'm not a chair, I am not you as a person, therefore I'm different. That's kind of the basic substance of the basic assumption of psychoanalysis. And then, of course, there's this other category of the abject, which is everything that we need to evacuate from our body in order to keep our integrity, in order to survive. The image that I give you is taken from David Cronenberg's film Videodrome, where his intestines ooze out of the TV. A very strong image, I thought. Now, Sloterdijk finds fault with the very clear-cut diagram of psychoanalysis, where the subject is seen in isolation, in fact, as an autonomous being facing all these other entities that are clearly separate from the subject. And Sloterdijk introduces another term into the mix. He calls that other entity an object, a non-object. Space is never empty and unobstructed without resistances, but it is always already an interior of sorts, full of denied things, repressed conditions, demands from coexistent entities, or sound, or space is never empty. The example that he gives is the womb, the human being in the womb. So the question is, why has Western philosophy always insisted, when they thought of the subject, as an autonomous being? The subject never appears autonomously, but always in relation to another, from the first moment on, a being comes to be in the womb, he or she is in dialogue with a mother. So that is the basis for Sloterdijk's theory. And he says, well, this subject, the kind of autonomous being, might have been the dominant protagonist of the 20th century, but is no longer. The long story short, the 19th and 20th century modern conception of a universal, extensive, and homogeneous space, universal space, is replaced with Sloterdijk's notion of Weltinnenraum, the world interior space. We don't live in an open universal space, but humans inhabit spheres, interior spaces. These interiors complicate the strict categories which have been upheld under the different strands of 20th century critical and analytical culture. And Sloterdijk sees in their existence the dismantling of the myth of the unencumbered, autonomous, critical individual of modernity. So now to the question of articulate form and Colin Rowe. Colin Rowe's formal analysis in architecture are a perfect example of a theory based on the 20th century autonomous subject. The approach based on the clear separation between the critical subject and the analytical object. Architecture is out there, the subject is here, and I see through buildings. Remember, phenomenal transparency, right? Let's recall how Rowe reads an architectural building, an architectural form. Building on the cubist and neoplastic ideas of transparency, Rowe takes the example of Le Corbusier's League of Nations project from 1927, a project you know well, as the epitome of a space built on a logic of layered formal systems. This is in his seminal transparency essay from 1963. Now here's how. He conceptualizes the building in a series of formal elements inserted into a spatial matrix of parallel striations. This is like an X-ray view of the building. And this is a conceptual argument, meaning there's no loss of information through the system. If the viewer stands here, he or she can just see through the building, because it's a conceptual argument. No loss of information along space, because space is not really there. It's just conceptual space, open, universal space. Here is the same argument, I would say, illustrated by somebody who was close to Rowe, Bernhard Hössli, and I just brought it in because it's so damn clear that how he analyzes a painting by Le Corbusier as a series of two-dimensional layers that are then overlapped. So this is a 2.5-dimensional reading of architecture, meaning a series of 2D layers, never 3D. In the transparency essay, the same essay, Rowe contrasts the assertive planes of Corbusier building, which are, quote, like knives for the appropriate slicing of space, to the amorphic outline, that's the word he uses, of Walter Gropius's Bauhaus. Amorphic, meaning illegible, because it cannot be analyzed in terms of the same stratification of space. It remains illegible from the vantage point of an ideal observer who thinks of deep space as a series of overlapping planes. In a sense, Rowe here anticipates a critical difference which would, in the 1990s, become a central theme of discussion in architecture, Gilles Deleuze's distinction between a smooth and a striated diagram. Now, today, the assumption that architectural form is decoded from the vantage point of an ideal observer in a layered and striated space that extends into deep space just seems out of sync with the way architects conceive and think of spatial structures. With today's ubiquitous computer-aided design technology, all buildings have turned literally transparent as wireframes on computer screens and become easily analyzable in all their spatial dimensions at once. And I'm not showing you the idea of the computer transparency on the screen. I assume you know what that looks like, a wireframe, but I'm showing you these translucent nylon installations by Do Ho Soo, which I find absolutely stunning, that you can see through these buildings. What is more, on a screen, gravity can at best be simulated when one works on a project. Forms emerge from an environment that does not distinguish between plan and section. So architectural diagrams today tend to be volumetric rather than 2.5-dimensional to start with. And you can see that when you look at projects like UN Studios or Ben van Berkel's Möbius house, which builds on the twisted and involuted logic of two lines that contain volumes of space and intersect in specific points. This building cannot be analytically striated to yield information about deep space in terms of Rowe's linear and layered notion of transparency. Its rational diagram, which was first conceptualized by the 19th century astrologist and mathematician Möbius, August Ferdinand Möbius, loops in all directions of space rather than simply from the inside of the building towards its facade. Despite the Möbius house partial literal transparency in terms of windows or standpoints in space, no standpoint in space affords the total view of the diagram. It requires a volumetric or spherical reconstruction. The formal clues for such a mental construction are distributed through space rather than compressed into the flat surface of a facade. So we have reached a point in history where a majority of architectural projects are based on morphological attributes which would rank them in Rowe's category of the amorphic, including the Möbius house. So we are at a point where, in fact, we would say we can't read buildings anymore, and I refuse to believe that. In fact, what I suggest is that in terms of Rowe's specific way, taken from Cubism, to look at buildings, we indeed cannot analyze buildings any longer because that analysis yields nothing. But we can find a different history of precedents than Rowe that will allow us to again read and analyze form. Now, so my open question is to ask how can we add to Rowe's theory in such a way that contemporary architecture is not simply left out because it is considered amorphic, meaning we can't talk about it, while we keep squeezing Palladio, by the way, for the last drop of conceptual juice, while he might already have run dry in architectural theory. So rather than go back to Palladio over and over again, or Alberti, all these guys that we have been hearing about over and over again, instead of doing that, I recommend that we look at another set of morphological features in architecture and find an alternative history for them. So here are just a few suggestions of how to go about this, and this is just supposed to prompt more work to come. I mean, I'm at the beginning with this. A first observation is that volumetric diagrams are mostly unreadable from their outsides, whereas Rowe looked always at the facade for clues about deep space, right? That was the argument. But volumetric diagrams are unreadable from the outside. We saw that worlds get built from the inside out. They are not a matter of subdividing universal space. Kiesler's endless house is fundamentally interiorized and can only unravel its itinerant logic from within the volumetric diagram. One of the features of involuted architecture is the gradual loss of morphological specificity through the medium of space, whereas in the whole of 20th century we thought of space as just homogeneous, no loss of information, right? Because it is all conceptually conceived. Here, from the computers, we have in fact learned that we can reintroduce heterogeneity by seeing space as a dense medium, meaning buildings today, and I give you the example by UN Studio again, this one is a South Korean building. This building, based on an internal rotation, as we learned from the diagram, is highly specific on the interior, but yields almost no information on the exterior. Only a bulge in the facade. So phenomenal transparency doesn't give you much. Rowe's phenomenal transparency doesn't offer much. I would think that the precedent for this would be, of course, Jean Nouvel's Tokyo Opera project, where you see the complete erasure of a gridded information on the facade that would have been comprehensible to Rowe. This is a precedent for what Rowe would have called amorphous. But we can collect these projects and start to discuss differences. A difference being that between that Nouvel's bulge of the facade is a simple pushing outwards of boxes into the wrapper, whereas the elongated dilation of UN Studio's Galleria insinuates the spatial trajectory of the circulation inside the building. So we can begin to read these new morphological features, but we need to start collecting many, many buildings and compare them to one another and discuss them comparatively. Another characteristic of involuted architecture is the morphological detachment from the orthogonal datum of the ground. And you know that Rowe totally took seriously Le Corbusier's suggestion that the plan is the generator. But that's no longer true. And once that's no longer true, you know, the ground is no longer the datum. The vertical section is no longer a datum. But as we see here, in the comparison between two buildings, Korb Himmelblau and Fuchshaus, you see that there's a diagonal rotation suggested in both cases with the diagrid construction of the facade. So in the case of Korb, we know that they use the metaphor of the tornado for this space. Architecture is supposed to be related to the logic of clouds, of the sublime of the weather, to liberate itself from the dictates of gravity. And the diagrid is one of the techniques to achieve this. Again, Rowe did not include the spatial device of the leaning volumes from in his lexicon, because Rowe, for instance, said about Jim Sterling's facades, which started to lean, that they were illegible. Now, if those were illegible, these certainly are illegible for Rowe. But here, again, we can start to be attentive to a different set of morphological features, like the differences in how the diagrid is organized in different buildings. The loop is another one of those formal devices for these spaces, especially those that leave the horizontal orientation and are used to accept the orthogonal logic of gravity. In Fuchshaus, we see the use of the non-orientable surfaces known from the mathematical figure of the Klein bottle. You know the figure from mathematics. This is the Klein bottle that is in fact a 3D version of the Möbius strip that has only one surface that turns from an inside to an outside in very fluid ways. Well, that's exactly what Fuchshaus does in his building, where the roof structure becomes the most internal space in the building, or where certain surfaces that come from an outside turn into an inside in the building. Bruskov is a precedent for this. Now, in Rowe's history, Bruskov has no place, because he wouldn't have known what to do with Bruskov. So maybe Goff could be an addition to the alternative history that we would dig out. In UN Studios Stuttgart Museum, the ramp system turned from walkable ramp surfaces into exhibition walls. So you have this volumetric or gravitational logic of the diagram that takes precedence over gravity, the verticality of gravity. So you see that the objects that are in fact supposed to sit on the ground now are climbing walls, if you will. And Foster's City Hall atrium destabilizes the verticality of the force of gravity by amping up the horizontal agitation of the ramp system. So these are just a beginning and three features of this new type of involutionary architecture that I think is the most radical change in contemporary architecture that we see in comparison to virtually all of 20th century architecture, both modern architecture, the grid, and postmodern architecture, think Labyrinth. In conclusion, I believe that many people are theorizing contemporary architecture solely from the vantage point of technology, and it's done over and over again, therefore I don't need to add that. Mostly digital technology that opens up a wide range of intricate formal possibilities, of course, for architecture. For me, these investigations mostly still leave open the question about the cultural meaning of the contemporary spatiality, which I think we can now start to conceptualize, also in a non-technological and perhaps a more philosophical terms, especially in relation to the very strong postmodern paradigm of space we left about 1 to 2 decades ago. So I think this initial moment of awe in front of the new technological possibilities, digital technologies, is over. This naive moment where everybody was fascinated with just what digital technology could produce. And it is now important to somehow look at what new types of space have been created and set them in relationships to, in a discursive relationship to what we have known about space in the last century. The questioning of the autonomous subject that was the central protagonist of all intellectual debates in the critical or the analytical century, which the 20th century was, the critical century, opens up new ways of understanding space today. More than a simple rejection of the autonomous subject, however, I think that we start to see the reasons for why we, today, are necessarily part of a subjectivity that is more involved and less analytically distanced from the world surrounding us. Sloterdijk certainly makes a convincing case, in my mind, that in the era of choice worldviews and choice identities, think Facebook, where all of you are not just one persona, but you can be whoever you choose to be, depending on which Facebook profile you create, you construct. Space is no longer the shared, universal, and open megasphere, but it becomes more specific, plural, and possibly more self-involved. Certainly, space has so radically changed lately that any of the previous models of big spatial categories have to be revised. And I'm thinking, for example, just of Gideon's tripartite classification of space, of all space, into Greek, the body in open space, Roman space, the negative space in the dense texture, and modern space. Well, I think it is about time that we add to that list and become more nuanced about it. Thank you. Are there any questions? What I was saying, yeah, go ahead.
I had a question from the beginning, and now I have a different question at the end, because somewhere along the line, you did a three-card Monty on me. Sort of like, I was watching the show over here, then you put one over there. Because at the beginning, it seemed like, your account of postmodern from 72 to 2000 period, let's say, was a very nuanced elaboration of work that had been dismissed by people like Jameson, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess my question at the beginning of the lecture was, do you fear doing the same thing for this involuted work? Because at the beginning it seems quite like almost dismissive toward a whole body of work from Ito to UNC, et cetera, that seems to have these characteristics of no longer the discursive postmodern. That was not pastiche, it was self-reflexive irony, but in a way you apply the Jameson critique now to work that comes later, because in a certain way this involuted work, you could say, would be like his ideas of postmodern space in Portland or...
I disagree. I totally disagree. I think, by the way, Jameson's book on postmodernism is one of the most powerful statements about postmodernism, I must say. But I don't agree with him, for the simple reason that he doesn't approach the topic as an architect. And as an architect, I feel like I'm personally attacked by Jameson because he says things about postmodern spaces that I just don't see, because partly his examples that he chooses are really not so big on the map of an architect. Of course, the Bonaventure Hotel, what is the statement that Jameson makes? It is a lobby, a space, an internal space. When you enter it, you get lost. Meaning you lose any sense of direction. And that, for him, means that that's exactly where society is in postmodernism. It has lost its direction. It has no sense of orientation any longer. The argument is a Marxist one. And whenever a Marxist is at work, the story is always the same, which is who controls and who is being repressed. Right? So by building spaces that make everybody lose direction, who provides that space? Of course, it's capitalism. And who is being repressed? All of us poor people. I felt that was I understand what he's saying, but I felt that there's so much more to postmodernism than just losing direction, and therefore I needed to say something else about postmodernism. And by the way, the title of my book is modeled onto the title of Jameson's book, because Jameson's book is Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, and my book is Irony or the blah 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 of postmodernism.
I guess my question is, I get that you disagree with him about that period, but are you taking his criteria to the new?
No, because I'm saying I'm not critical of these new spaces. In fact, I'm saying we need to come up with ways to talk about them. So I'm, unlike Jameson, I'm not saying the world is going to go under because the society has lost its way, has lost its sense of direction. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, I'm saying that's what Rowe would have said, and I refuse to say that because we can't just live in a world where all we can say about is that we have lost our way, because suddenly we don't know how to find Palladio in these buildings. And knowing where you come from and where I come from, what is, of course, the center of this debate is the idea of the critical. And I think that being critical means something very different in different moments in time. And that the critical moment where Palladio was the only important thing to architecture, because Palladio had architecture, right? Everybody else was just kind of a derivative of Palladio. I don't want to repeat that story anymore because it has become so boring. And clearly, it has nothing to do with the types of spaces that get created in studios today. So, unlike Jameson, I don't want to say, oh my God, we have to bring the sheep back onto the right track. In fact, I'm saying, well, the sheep are where they are, we are where we are. Now we need to figure out how to talk about this stuff. Because all the usual reaction in juries today is that people say, oh, don't be critical, don't even talk about it. This works, this doesn't work, make it a little more, tweak it here, make it a little more pink. I don't know how to operate like that. So, in fact, what Rowe did for postmodern space, I feel is very useful, but it's over. And we need to do something just as useful about contemporary space than what he did for that type of space. Ezra.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. This was really excellent, of course. And so you presented this as the architecture of the zeitgeist, right? And spirit of the times, so not of architectural times, but of the times in general. And then suddenly, I was running in my mind as you were speaking some of the attributes of the zeitgeist, of the spirit of our times, and I was having a hard time fitting them into concepts like curling up, interiority, being closed, and so on. I mean, some of the things that I think are very paradigmatic in our times are open forums, whether it's the Occupy movement or the cycle of struggles, global connectivity, I mean, the infinite expanding internet, practices without borders, actors without borders, and so on. So, I mean, there is also this metaphor of openness. I mean, whether you are cynical about it, whether you think it's close or whatever, but it is still one of the attributes of the zeitgeist. So, in a way, how do you explain this? I mean, is this a disjunction between contemporary architecture and some of the other practices in the art world, in philosophy and so on? Or is this an impossibility of the zeitgeist architecture in a way that architecture doesn't necessarily have to be completely in line with the art world or the world and so on? So how do you put in the metaphor of openness?
It's a very good question. I mean, we have lived the history of the internet, right? So we kind of know the internet really well. It's the only history that we know well because we've been there every single day of that history. The internet in the 1990s was a radically different internet than today. And if you say that the internet is kind of the dream of openness, it's realized the internet, I cannot disagree more, because what is currently happening is that the internet turns into a series of different lounges, closed lounges, clubs, right? LinkedIn, Facebook, this and that. You need more and more passwords to do anything on the internet. It didn't used to be that way 10 years ago, when the internet was the Wild West, meaning it was just big open space where everybody could participate everywhere. Nothing was regulated. You didn't go to, the police would never show up at your door for what you did on the internet. That has changed. And it has changed because the internet is closing spaces. Facebook is just the biggest sphere, the biggest interior space there is in the internet at the moment. So, and I suggested in the talk at some point that visual metaphors change, and whereas in the 90s the internet was always represented with these open grid systems that would disappear in the galaxies, right? I remember as a kid I would read science journals, and they would always talk about data highways. And I know that as a kid I thought, wow, I want to go to a data highway, right? I want to be on that highway. But I didn't really know how to conceptualize it. Where is that place? Well, but the representation of those places was always, data highway is a straight line past all the galaxies. It has changed. The visual metaphors have changed. They have closed off. Suddenly, the planets, the morphology of planets as closed spheres has been appropriated by the way we represent the space of the internet. And those are enclaves. Now, if that is good or bad is to be decided next. But, for example, when I talked about the urban enclaves, and I showed Dubai, I would be extremely critical of those enclaves because I haven't been there, but I don't expect to like any of that stuff because on photos they look just terrible. I mean, this monocultures of banal villas next to one another on the Palm or the World. It's just so boring. And also, of course, politically dubious. Or awesome. Well, yes, no, not really, because there are other things that I really like. I think that the Mercedes-Benz Museum by UN Studio is one of the most powerful buildings in the last 10 years. I mean, it's just kick-ass. I mean, it's really a good building. And also that Fuxas shopping mall, I think is just completely different from anything we've seen. And I like those spaces. Now you could say, well, those are just more enclaves. Well, they might be enclaves, but so you can always apply the Marxist criticism, especially when it comes to architecture, the superstructure. Architecture is always, the representative of capital. When it becomes complicated to build, Jameson's critique will always be true, kind of true. But as architects, what are we supposed to do? So I am not Jameson. I'm really not Jameson, but I think that Jameson's book is one of the best books about postmodernism. We get it. We don't need to write another book about postmodernism from a Marxist point of view. Know about today's architecture because it's always the same thing. They all say the same thing. And I would even say that about Reinhold. I mean, just always the same thing.
It seems like you prefer the architecture to the urbanism of this effect. So the issue is, you fall back into a kind of Albert Pope position vis-a-vis the city and the spiral and the inward turn, which is really his terms of analysis of the closed city.
Well, there are urban proposals, mostly in the 1960s and 70s, that are very promising. Walter Jonas's Intrapolis, which is a series of round urban oases that are like a huge interior space with apartment buildings built around a central green. That's promising. I mean, it's utopian, quasi-utopian. But I'm not there yet. I mean, I just finished irony. I want to move into the next thing, and I don't want to constantly complain that the world is going in the wrong place. Instead, I want to say, well, there's always a risk. I think Dubai is where it went wrong, but there are other possibilities, and maybe in my next version of the talk, I would have to find an urban example that is convincing. Yes?
You mentioned the phenomenology of roundness and that there's an intimacy versus the geometry of roundness. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that, because aren't they intrinsically tied in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, round is round, also the form is round. I mean, but in Bachelard in fact says, if we want to understand what round means, we have to approach the question from the viewpoint of the poet rather than the viewpoint of a scientist. And the scientist would want to measure the morphology of roundness, and Bachelard would say, well, if you measure it, it gives you nothing. You still don't know what it is. And what he proposes is that you need to understand how roundness has certain affective experiences attached to it that makes us understand what it means to be, a community, or to make you understand sweetness. Sweetness is, by the way, one of the characteristics that Sloterdijk would pick up from Bachelard, because candy is round, and so the roundness of candy we associate with the sweetness of roundness. For a 20th century tough architect, right, autonomous tough architect, sweetness is just stupid, right? Sweetness doesn't do anything. Geometry does something. Grid, give me a grid. Sweetness, forget color. Color is sweet. Color is soft. Doesn't give you anything in architecture. Would have been the prejudice. Well, I think we think about those things slightly differently now. And Bachelard wanted to say that if you want to understand what round means, it is not a problem of geometric measure only, but it has something to do with the affective experience of roundness. And the examples that he gives is that you want to hug something that is round. Again, for a 20th century macho architect, hugging is not something that is not a word to be used, right? It's just, again, stupid. But maybe that has changed. And so that's what Bachelard is after. By the way, when I looked into irony, there was a similar contrast. Jankelevich, a philosopher of irony, would say, if you want to understand irony, you cannot approach the world like a geometer would, but you have to be a poet. Meaning, in order to understand that the world is deeply paradoxical, strange, funny, off, you have to be a poet, because a geometrician will always see their theory of precision reconfirmed. The world is so precise. Well, to a poet, the world is not precise and measurable, and it's just weird. It's comical. It's so freaking strange. But you have to be a certain type of person to understand that, and the geometer will not understand that.
Why do you keep on thinking in the terms that you're saying that you don't want to think anymore, like it's kind of like dual, black, white? For example, you said that the poet is highly technical to make the reference effective. So what would you say are things like Sejima's Lausanne, for example, where it's a grid-based building that provides interiority, that is super soft and is sweet. So it does not belong to any kind of dual dichotomy world that you're setting up for clarifying.
Well, in fact, my role would be to undo those oppositions. But of course, in order to make clear how we are in a different place, it's kind of
that's removing complexity of the question as well, no? Like, because you are like removing, for example, the role of geometry within the new kind of way of talking about the new space that you are claiming with. All those people that you are showing us, from Fuchsas to UN Studio, will be highly geometrically based.
Because of course those things are not separate. They cannot be separate.
That's my point. That's right. How can we just talk about those things without having to relate on separation? Like without having to go back to this kind of dichotomy structure of thinking and much more relational.
Well, you know.
It's not a question. It's not like I'm just trying to.
No, yeah. In fact, yeah. There's no answer that I can give except to say that I have to go back to the drawing board and find the kind of terms to avoid those dichotomies, because I wouldn't want them to exist. By the way, when you read Sloterdijk, the trilogy of spheres, as an architect you would think, yay, here, give me the spherical form, right? I want to learn about the spherical form, and he even says in the introduction that that life is a question of form. And as an architect, you think, wow, okay, form. I'm an architect. I want to understand form. And then you realize that in his book, he talks about spheres in a very metaphorical way. And then you say, well, as an architect, I would want to rewrite those books, but this time take the form of the spherical form really seriously. So I would want geometry to play a role. I mean, of course, I wouldn't want to just throw away geometry. So you are absolutely right.
I was going to just highlight, because you were like, I was going to go away from the metaphorical role of the form and just become much more specific to the discipline which involves precision geometry.
Right. But that is where, in fact, the format of this is very useful, because I think that what happened in architectural theory is that, and I'm thinking of Sylvia Levin, that in fact the pendulum went from one extreme to the other, where suddenly everything that has to do with architecture in the more traditional sense, that includes, of course, the question of geometry, is bad and is old, and it's all about Pipilotti wrists, pink flowers projected onto the MoMA walls, and I wouldn't want to go all the way to the other extreme, where I would say, yeah, everybody gets candy now in studio, and let's just enjoy the sweetness. And screw architecture, geometry. I wouldn't want to do that, because I don't think it would be useful. I think we have to always enter a paradigm to then shift it slightly, instead of just say, oh, that was all stupid, let's do something else. So I agree with you. Yes?
You speak a lot about the helix, which has a very specific relationship with the image that you showed was a sphere that required a staircase to access, the sphere, and that is a very different relationship to ground. I wonder if you can begin to talk about the status of the dome for the arch.
Well, all those. Eventually, I will have to kind of catalog all those spatial and formal devices and figure out what fits where. But I'm not there yet. I think that I really wanted to just say that if you just look at it again, look at the 20th century, and look at where we are at the moment, there's something completely different happening. And we need to start now opening up the topic to its different dimensions. And for instance, understanding how a helix is different from a double helix, is different from an open swirl, all these differences will then very, very much matter. But I'm not there yet. And I'm not there yet because it's just damn difficult to find a history that has been repressed through at least 100 years. Because we know how to go from Alberti to Palladio to Schinkel to Mies to, we all know that by heart. There's no point in rehearsing that history except if we really want to add that one footnote that nobody thought of Schinkel saying that one thing that will make us rethink the series. I don't want to write that footnote. I'm not interested. By the way, footnotes are very important because the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns was started in a footnote, right? It's apparently, if one believes in Mulgrave's anthology, he talks about how that footnote is what started it all. So footnotes are important, but I'm not a footnote writer. I'm an architect, and architects in general are not good footnote writers.
Because of the work that you're looking at has been canonized, perhaps by the technophilic side, to recuperate it for a cultural argument still leaves out other work, whether it's Ezra's work, the cheap sites, or whether it's how do you deal with Chris O'Deveron, PGTBS, a whole series of firms that in some way could be seen as continuations of the first story you told and aren't immediately jumping into the involuted, sensational, saturated, basically architectural versions of what you showed at the beginning, which was the green room, which clearly has a negative connotation.
Well, I mean, it's a very tough one for me to figure out because I started looking at round things, and inevitably you go to Bucky Fuller, to Aldo van Eyck, to Fry Otto, all those architects that in fact I have big problems with, but just because they were so such techno freaks, and I don't find that a Fuller building is not an interesting building. I mean, these spheres, they just don't do much. They're always the same thing. I have a little bit of hope because Fuller was such a cuckoo. I mean, it's always connected to some completely weird stories about how humanity is going to leave planet Earth and inhabit, artificial planets. And that's where I become hopeful that maybe this kind of cultural baggage, the dreams that humans have, can be made into a big story rather than his speculations about the geodesic sphere. And so that is a very good question and a big problem for me because in fact I was trained on architects that had a very big cultural understanding and put culture first and then technology second. And now I have to look into all these techno freaks and have to somehow find the culture in that. But it's very well hidden. It's not there. Well, maybe it's not there, but then I will just make it up. I mean, in a way, you don't need to wait for the evidence that you find in history to deliver you the whole story. Sloterdijk made something. Well, Sloterdijk made a fantastic story out of spheres and spheres, and in fact it becomes really interesting really fast. I mean, Jules Verne's travel around the world and into the galaxies and under the sea. It's all happening in spheres, and I mean there are big dreams, poetic dreams attached to this form of roundness. And it's something it's a story that has just been repressed for at least 100 years, and therefore the history doesn't exist because another Marxist argument, right? Walter Benjamin, there's no document of history that isn't also a document of barbarism, just because certain stories don't get told for the reason that everybody wants them to disappear. But the story that we hear over and over again is boring. I mean, I don't want to hear about Mies anymore because it's done, it's over, there's nothing, I mean, and at the moment there's just nothing new to be said about it. I hope that we call it as a off. But I know it's just, let's just say this.
5 miles south?
Thank you.